everyone, this is David. Thanks for listening to the Bean to Barstool podcast. Enjoy. I launched Bean to Barstool almost 3 years ago now, and while we've taken some deep dives on a lot of beer and chocolate topics, I realized recently I've never actually just walked through the basics of beer on this show. A lot of my listeners come to this podcast from the craft chocolate world, and given how complicated and overwhelming beer can be, I want to make sure you all get to enjoy the beer-related parts of Bean to Barstool to the fullest. Today we're going to look at the ingredients and processes of brewing and some frequently asked questions about beer, which will hopefully make the beer conversations we have on this show going forward make more sense and be even more enjoyable. Grab a beer and listen in. This is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. My name is David Nilsson. I'm a professional beer writer and an advanced cicerone, and the creator and host of Bean to Barstool. In this episode, we're going to talk all about the basics of beer, how it's made, what it's made from, and some styles and terms you might run into. The music for this episode is by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool. Way back in episode 22, we interviewed Scott Watson, the founder and chocolate maker at Loon Chocolate and a former professional brewer. Scott explained that one of the reasons he loves both beer and chocolate is that both involve the transformation of ingredients into something unrecognizable when finished. Artisan products like wine and coffee, by contrast, undergo a relatively simple process from raw ingredient to a beverage we enjoy. Both are dazzlingly complex from a sensory standpoint and involve tremendous skill on the part of farmers and makers to produce, but much of their beauty is found in the elegant simplicity of their production. Beer and chocolate, however, undergo very complicated and often counterintuitive processes on their road from agricultural ingredients to packaged products. In some ways, this has hurt both beer and chocolate, as consumers have less connection to and knowledge of the raw ingredients that go into both. The opacity of processes and obscurity of ingredients behind both has made it more difficult to understand the artistry behind beer and chocolate. Today we're going to demystify beer by talking about beer ingredients, brewing processes, and frequently asked questions. This will hopefully make beer easy to understand for the chocolate lovers who listen to this show, or anyone who wants to better understand this beverage without being talked over or talked down to. Some of this will sound complicated at first, but we'll go through it step by step. Beer is traditionally brewed from 4 basic ingredients: water, malt, hops, and yeast. Other ingredients can be and are sometimes used, and we'll talk about those later on. Let's walk through each of these ingredients and talk about what they are, why they're used, and how they fit into the brewing process. Let's start with malt, the foundational ingredient in beer. Malt is a grain, usually barley, but sometimes wheat, rye, oats, or something else, that has been prepared for brewing. I'll explain what that means in just a moment. Malt provides all or almost all of the fermentable sugars for any given beer. It's almost always solely responsible for the color of a beer, and it provides the protein matrix that creates that attractive collar of foam on the top of a fresh pint. It's also what gives a beer an enjoyable texture or mouthfeel and has a significant influence on a beer's flavor and aroma, in some cases providing almost all of the flavor and aroma in a given beer. Simply put, malt influences every single sensory aspect of a beer: appearance, texture, smell, taste, and the love child of smell and taste, flavor. So what does it mean that barley has been malted? It begins with natural processes in a grain of barley that are accelerated by the maltster, the person who turns barley and other grains into malt, and concludes with a variety of ways the maltster then halts those processes. To understand malting, we have to talk about enzymes. When I start to talk about enzymes during a beer event, I can sometimes see attendees begin to check out a bit, because even the word enzyme sounds hopelessly complex and scientifically abstract. In reality, the basic function of any individual enzyme isn't that hard to understand. Enzymes are intricately folded three-dimensional protein molecules that facilitate biochemical processes within an organism. Because of their dynamic role in living processes, it can be easy to think of them as microorganisms themselves, but they aren't alive. They just exist as part of larger organisms. Each enzyme generally performs a single task on a single material or substrate and is helpfully named after the substrate it works on. Proteases work on proteins and cellulases on cellulose, for example. As I mentioned, enzymes are protein molecules folded into specific three-dimensional shapes. That shape allows them to interact with and modify the structure of another substance at the molecular level, but prevents them from interacting with molecules of a different shape. You can think of each type of enzyme as a three-dimensional key that will fit a specific lock but won't fit another. Every living organism has a large variety of enzymes that allow basic cellular and biochemical processes to occur. In barley and other grains, some of those enzymes perform roles that allow an individual grain, or seed, to produce a new plant. Plants produce energy through photosynthesis, which requires sunlight. When a seed begins growing under the soil, however, it doesn't have access to sunlight, so it needs a reserve of energy to fuel the plant until it can break through the soil. Most of the bulk of a kernel of grain is comprised of carbohydrates that provide that fuel. The seed will ultimately need those in the form of simple sugars in order to use them, but sugars aren't a great long-term storage solution for a variety of reasons, so that fuel is locked up in a complex starch matrix held inside small pockets within the grain's endosperm. It's a stable storage system that can wait for months or even years for the right conditions, and once the right temperature and moisture conditions are met, enzymes are the keys that unlock that storage system. Plant hormones within the grain stimulate the production and release of enzymes that will turn that starch reserve into usable fuel. Hemicellulases and beta-glucanases break down the dividing membranes, proteases convert proteins into peptides and free amino acids, and amylases and dextrinases begin turning starch into sugar. When it comes to producing malt for brewing beer or certain spirits, a maltster manipulates those temperature and moisture conditions to stimulate the development of those enzymes, because we'll need them for the brewing process. Proteins need to be reduced, starch reserves need to be exposed, and ultimately, starch needs to be converted into simple sugars like maltose in order to be fermented by brewing yeast. After a few days under the right hydration and temperature conditions, the grain's internal structure has been sufficiently modified to allow it to be brewed with, and at this point, the maltster wants to halt the process, because otherwise the grain will do what it was supposed to do and grow a new barley plant. We don't want a new barley plant, though. We want beer. So the maltster halts the modification process by drying the malt out before all the starch is converted into sugar, so the brewer can finish that conversion during the brewing process. In order to brew, you need malt, and in order to make malt, you have to trick grain into trying to grow a new plant. We'll talk about how malt gets used in the brewing process in just a moment, but first, let's talk about some of the different types of malt. Base malts are the workhorse malts that provide the foundation for almost all beer styles, are dried at relatively low heat in kilns, and retain their usable starches and enzymes needed to convert those starches fully into sugars. The temperatures and times used to do this will lead to variations in these base malts. Different base malts can have flavors of flour, bread dough, bread, crackers, cookies, toast, bread crust, nuts, or others. Roasted malts are roasted in a rotating drum roaster in much the same way coffee beans or cacao beans are roasted, and they take on many of the same flavors found in those foods, as well as burnt caramel, char, and others. The rotating drum allows for high temperature to be applied without burning the malt, leading to dark colors and often intensely roasty flavors. The malt's enzymes are destroyed during this process, and its sugars are rendered mostly or entirely unfermentable, so this range of malts can only be used as a relatively small percentage of a beer's grain bill. Another group of malts are known as caramel or crystal malts. In these malts, the starch to sugar conversion that would normally take place during the first stage of the brewing process is completed inside the grain of barley, and the malt is then either roasted or kilned, crystallizing and caramelizing those resulting sugars. This leads to flavors of caramel, candy, dried fruit, toffee, and others. Additionally, malts can sometimes be dried out in unique ways, such as over wood smoke or in the open air without the application of heat. In both cases, this will have an impact on the flavors of the finished malt. Once the malts have been dried out using one of these means, they are shelf-stable potentially for years, waiting for a brewer to complete the cereal grain's transformation into beer. Within all of these types of malt, there are many variations and gradations, giving brewers a lot of options for building beer recipes. As I mentioned earlier, barley has characteristics that make it favorable for brewing, but other grains can be used as well. Each will contribute its own unique characteristics to a beer, but most are only used as part of a beer's recipe. Even in the case of beer styles named for grains like wheat, rye, or oats, those titular grains make up only a percentage of the overall grist. The rest is usually barley malt. If any chocolate lovers listening want to get a taste of brewer's malt in a familiar context, try chocolate bars such as French Broad Malted Milk, Om Black and Burnt Barley, or Indulgence Porter or IPA, all of which are made with malt. So how does malt actually get used during the brewing process? Once a brewer has selected the malt she'll use for the recipe she's brewing, she'll need to grind or mill the malt into a coarse meal. Then it's time to begin the first stage of the actual brewing process, the mash. Inside a vessel called a mash tun, the brewer mixes their malt with hot water, generally around 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Over the course of about an hour, the diastatic enzymes developed during the malting process break down the malt starches into simple sugars in a process called saccharification. The primary enzymes at work, alpha and beta amylase, work in complementary ways to break apart amylases and amylopectins into mostly maltose and a few other simple sugars. Curiously, these two enzyme groups favor slightly different temperature ranges. Adjusting the temperature of the mash just a few degrees can favor one or the other of those enzymes and affect the amount of fermentable sugar in the resulting wort, which is what we call the sugary malty liquid that comes from the mash and will be fermented into beer. Slightly lower temperatures favor beta amylase, slightly higher alpha amylase. Mashing in beta amylase's preferred range will lead to more fermentable sugar and a drier bodied beer, as more of the malt sugars will be fermented away. Mashing in alpha amylase's preferred range will do the opposite. The brewer will choose a temperature, or in some cases, a series of temperature rests to achieve the results they're looking for. Depending on the malts being used, the equipment being used, and the proclivities of the brewer, a mash might be held at a single temperature for the entire time, called an infusion mash, or might stop at various steps or rests, which will allow other processes to occur, such as breaking down protein in more rustic malt or bringing out particular flavor attributes. This is called a step mash. After the mash is complete, the wort is drained off the grain bed. It's recirculated back through the malt for a bit to make sure all the good stuff we want has been extracted and to let the grain and its husks filter and clarify the wort. Then it's drained into the boil kettle for the next step of the process. The process of separating wort from grain is called lautering and is sometimes done in a separate vessel and sometimes done in the mash tun itself. The leftover malt, called spent grain, then must be disposed of. Often a brewer will have an agreement with a local farm to give them the spent grain for feeding to livestock. It can also be cooked with. Spent grain pizza crust or cookies are delicious. After mashing and lautering, the brewer will begin the boil, which is exactly what it sounds like. The wort gets boiled for about an hour. This has several purposes. One is to coagulate proteins from the malt. Coagulating these proteins and removing them from the wort will lead to a better mouthfeel in the finished beer. There's a point in the boil called the hot break when you can actually see this happen. The gunky strips of protein look like egg drop soup and will end up sinking to the bottom of the kettle and will be removed. Also, the boil can be used to slightly reduce the overall volume of the beer, concentrating its strength and flavors, and in some cases, caramelizing malt sugars to impact flavor. Probably the most important purpose of the boil, however, brings us to our second major beer ingredient, hops. Hops are the primary seasoning agent in beer, and they're actually flowers, even though they look like little leafy green pine cones. The hops we use in brewing are the female flowers of the Humulus lupulus plant, a species we believe evolved about 6 million years ago in China. They thrive today from about 30 to 52 degrees latitude north or south of the equator. For our chocolate lovers out there, cacao grows in a band 20 degrees north and south of the equator, so there is nowhere in the world hops and cacao can be grown side by side. There are, however, two countries able to grow both in different regions currently, the US and Australia. Hop flowers are made up of small petals that overlap like scales on a fish around a central stalk or strig, and concealed under these petals is a waxy yellow substance called lupulin, which contains most of the good stuff we want for brewing. Hops grow on a vertical bine, that's bine with a B like boy rather than V like Victor. A vine, like what wine grapes grow on, grows vertically by attaching to a growing surface with tendrils or suckers, while a bine, as in the case of hops, grows vertically by wrapping its main stalk around the growing surface. In a hop yard, hops are grown on a trellis system of wooden poles connected by strings and wires. Hops grow rapidly and aggressively during the growing season. Their Latin name translates into small wolf, reaching 18 to 20 feet in height across the summer. They stay alive beneath the soil as rhizomes during the winter and will return again in the spring. Nothing looks quite like a hop yard in the summer, with 20-foot-tall hedgerows of green stacked one after the other across the field like the corridors of a gigantic maze. After being harvested, the cones are rapidly dried to preserve them, except for a small amount that will be used in seasonal wet hop beers to show off their fresh aromas, and are then either sold as whole dried cones or processed into compact pellets for easier storage and use. Hop companies have also experimented with many other hop-derived products over the years, such as powders and extracts. Hops provide two main things to beer: bitterness and aroma and flavor. The bitterness in hops comes from alpha and beta acids. In their natural state, these acids aren't all that bitter, and they're not all that liquid soluble either. Brewers unlock these bittering acids by boiling them. The boiling process causes the acids to isomerize, at which point they're significantly more bitter and more liquid soluble. Isomerization is when a molecule physically reconfigures without adding or removing molecular components. Brewers add hops early in the boil to allow these acids to isomerize. The flavor and aromas we get from hops come from essential oils, and the concentrations and interactions of these oils can be dazzlingly complex. They are highly aromatic, which means they are also highly volatile, and the oils from the hops added early in the boil get lost in the process. Brewers add hops for aroma and flavor late in the boil, just after the boil, or even in the fermenting or conditioning beer later on. This extracts the aromatic compounds without extracting much, if any, additional bitterness. Different hop varietals showcase markedly different aromas and flavors, and this is where hops get really interesting. There are well over 100 commercial hops available now, with more being hybridized and released to growers constantly. There are hop varietals that have been grown or used in brewing since the 19th century, and brand new ones that hit the market each year. Hops are grown in many places around the world within the latitudinal bands I mentioned earlier, including continental Europe and the UK, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, across the northern United States, and many other places. Hops grown in different regions can showcase different aroma traits. Hops can have aromas that are grassy, herbal, earthy, or floral, or they can showcase a wide range of fruity aromas, from citrus to tropical fruits to berries. Name a fruit, and there's probably a hop that smells like it, often because they actually share one or more aromatic compounds in common. I've led tastings with beers full of tropical fruit aromas and flavors, and had attendees who struggled to believe me that there wasn't actually mango or pineapple in the beer. It was all from the hops. Most of the commercial hops in the United States are grown in the Pacific Northwest states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, with the Yakima Valley of Washington looming particularly large. It's common to hear the name Yakima used synectically to refer to the Pacific Northwest hops industry as a whole. That said, more and more small hop farms have been popping up around the country. There are several very small hop farms right here in my rural Ohio county. There's a wild subspecies of Humulus lupulus that has evolved in New Mexico called Neomexicanus, and hops can even be found growing wild in some parts of the country, often as feral remnants of domestic hop ventures from earlier in the 20th or even 19th centuries. If our chocolate-loving listeners want to experience the difference between hop aroma and hop bitterness, there are two bars I would recommend tasting side by side. Nostalgia's hop-aged bar was aged in a bed of Chinook hops and soaked up the aroma of those aromatic flowers. It has a bold hoppy aroma, in this case orange and pine, but no bitterness since the hops themselves and their bitter acids were not included. Somerville's beer-fermented bar, on the other hand, was made with cacao steeped in fermenting beer right after the boil, and in addition to hop aroma, packs a punch of hop bitterness as well. After the boil is complete, the beer will be separated from the coagulated proteins and the vegetal hop matter, collectively known as trub, and then chilled down and moved into fermenters. Then our third major beer ingredient takes over. The overwhelming majority of beer is fermented by one of two species of yeast from the same genus. Saccharomyces cerevisiae ferments ales, and Saccharomyces pastorianus ferments lagers. We'll talk more about that distinction later on. Saccharomyces yeast is a microscopic fungus that consumes simple sugars and creates ethanol and carbon dioxide as byproducts. Once the brewer has cooled the unfermented beer down to the desired temperature for the yeast they're using, they add the yeast to the fermenter and let it do its thing. Fermentation will take anywhere from a few days to a couple weeks. During fermentation, the yeast will convert sugar into alcohol and CO2, but there are a host of other microbiological processes happening alongside this. The yeast is also absorbing oxygen early in the process, dividing into more yeast cells, absorbing nutrients such as nitrogen and zinc to keep itself healthy, consuming trace amounts of other compounds in the beer, and, depending on the strain of yeast being used, creating varying levels of many different aromatic compounds that will influence the taste of the finished beer. Depending on the desired result, the health of the yeast, and how well the process is planned and monitored, these flavors might be desirable or undesirable. When the yeast has finished fermenting the beer, it will usually settle to the bottom of the beer. In modern breweries, fermentation is done in vessels that have a cone-shaped bottom, allowing the brewer to harvest the yeast from a batch of beer and use it again if desired. There are a lot of flavor compounds yeast can potentially create in beer, some good and some bad. Esters will generally have fruity or floral aromas. If you've ever enjoyed a Hefeweizen, the banana flavor you get in that beer is from a yeast ester. Phenols generally have spicy, earthy, or even medicinal aromas. Going back to that Hefeweizen, the clove spice in that beer is from a yeast phenol. Some esters and phenols are pleasant, some are unpleasant, and some are pleasant on their own but shouldn't be present in certain styles. Some compounds the yeast can create are unpleasant or simply aren't desired in high concentrations or in certain styles. It's all about context. Earlier, I mentioned there are two main yeast species, one for ales and one for lagers, so let's spend a moment talking more about that. There are a lot of misconceptions about the difference between lager and ale. Thanks to mass-produced brands advertising bland, watery beers as the highest level of lager brewing, the average consumer thinks lager is code for flavorless or cheap. The truth is, lagers can be brewed with all the character and quality of ales, aren't necessarily weaker or milder beers than ales, and they certainly aren't easier to brew. Ale yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, prefers to work at a higher brewing temperature than lager yeast, Saccharomyces pastorianus. The lower temperature for lager means the yeast produces fewer aroma and flavor compounds. From a sensory standpoint, this means there are generally fewer yeast-derived aromas and flavors in lagers than in ales. Lager yeast does its work without leaving much trace of itself behind. Within both species, there are many strains, and they perform slightly differently, allowing a brewer to select the strain that will work best for the beer they're brewing. Beyond that, lagers can be every bit as characterful as ales, so if you hear lager and think boring, think again. After fermentation is complete, the beer will undergo a resting period at low temperatures, a stage called conditioning or secondary fermentation, or depending on how long it's carried out, lagering. This rest allows flavors in the beer to come together, some solids to drop out, and rough edges to be sanded off. This lasts from days to months, and generally speaking, lagers condition longer than ales. The word lager actually means to store, referring to this extended cold temperature rest. The one major beer ingredient we haven't talked about actually makes up the majority of the volume of a beer, usually about 95%. Water is hugely important to brewing, but it's an ingredient we don't often talk about because it can be hard to understand its importance. Water isn't just water. Groundwater in different locations will vary in its concentration of different minerals, and these trace minerals will impact things like yeast health and how the flavors of malt and hops are perceived. Many historical styles developed in specific locations because of the chemistry of the water available. Today, brewers can adjust the water chemistry of their brewing water to suit the style of beer they want to brew. So, that was all a lot of information. Let's recap real quick. Beer is brewed from 4 main ingredients: water, malt, hops, and yeast. Malt is enzymatically active grain, usually barley, that gets mixed with hot water during the mash to convert starch into sugar and extract flavor, aroma, and mouthfeel components. The resulting wort is then boiled, and hops are added to extract bitterness and flavor and aroma. The liquid is then cooled down and yeast is added. The yeast ferments sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide and can also contribute flavor and aroma. The beer rests for a bit, and then it's ready to be packaged or served. We're talking about beer basics today, but I imagine some of you want to go beyond the basics and become beer experts. You hear me say in every podcast introduction that I'm an advanced Cicerone, and a Cicerone certification can be a huge step in your beer career or education journey. It can also be pretty daunting. How are you supposed to know exactly what to study and what depth of knowledge you need to pass an exam? Don't worry, because the Beer Scholar has got you covered. The Beer Scholar is an education and preparation resource that currently offers efficient online courses for Cicerone levels 1 and 2, that's Cicerone Certified Beer Server and Certified Cicerone, that cover everything you need to know, plus contain lots of tips and tricks for how to crush the exams. When I was prepping for my Certified Cicerone exam years ago, I used the Beer Scholar study materials and found them super helpful. It helped me focus my study efforts on the areas I really needed to know and helped me understand what the exam experience would be like, which helped a lot with my anxiety heading into exam day. Now, the Beer Scholar has some big news. In June, they'll be launching a new advanced Cicerone coaching program. The Beer Scholar AC coaching program will include a full study schedule, a 3-month boot camp, another 3 months of weekly Q&A sessions, several full practice exams, and much more. I so wish this had existed when I was preparing for my advanced Cicerone exam. If you're ready to level up your beer career or just take the next step in your beer journey, visit thebeerscholar.com to check out their online courses. I'll link to that in the show notes. Now, back to our episode. Keeping in mind the basic ingredients and processes we just discussed, there are, of course, variations to all of these. Let's look at a few common ones. We've often talked about sour beers on Bean to Barstool. Sour and mixed fermentation beers undergo a fermentation by microorganisms beyond the 2 yeast species we talked about earlier. These include bacteria like Lactobacillus, Pediococcus, and Acetobacter, which produce sour acidity in the beer, and yeasts like Brettanomyces, which can produce a wide range of fruity or funky flavors. Due to various technicalities, traditions, and variations, not everyone agrees on what to call all of these beers, and some are not even sour. You might hear terms like kettle sour, spontaneous fermentation, or wild ale for different beers in this group. Common traditional sour styles include Berliner Weiss, Gose, Lambic, Gueuze, Flanders Red, and Oud Bruin, though there are many others and many modern beers that don't fall under an easy style umbrella. A lot of modern sours are made with fruit as well. Barrel-aged beers spend time aging in wooden barrels after fermentation is complete. These barrels can be second-use spirit or wine barrels or be made from some kind of virgin wood. The beer will take on character from both the wood and any liquid that was aged in it before it reached the brewery. The most common example are bourbon barrel-aged imperial stouts, but all manner of barrels get used on a lot of different beer styles. Finally, chocolate fans will be familiar with inclusions, which are added flavor ingredients in chocolate. In beer, we generally refer to these as adjuncts, and they can include just as wide a creative range as we see with chocolate inclusions. Fruits and spices are common, as are coffee, cacao, vanilla, and lactose. You might even run into more esoteric ingredients like mushrooms or botanicals. The sky's the limit. Let's talk a bit about styles. Within those overarching ale and lager umbrellas, there are well over 100 recognized beer styles, with lots of beers that don't fit into specific styles and serve as hybrids between them. Even the concept of styles is a confusing one. Surprisingly, the idea of beer styles is a relatively recent development. While there have always been different types of beer, strict style guidelines didn't start getting recognized until around the 1980s, and were largely due to the need for judging guidelines for homebrewing competitions, as well as the work of pioneering British beer writer Michael Jackson, who cataloged many of Europe's classic beer traditions. Styles don't exist as static rules as much as snapshots of how certain types of beer are brewed and perceived at different points in time. Styles have always changed because of changes in ingredients, laws, and popular tastes, so arguments over whether a particular beer matches a particular traditional style can exist on shaky ground. That said, preserving historical brewing traditions is hugely important, and conveying style information is important for communicating with consumers. Beer styles are based on differences in ingredients and processes. Selecting specific malts, hops, yeast, and water profiles, the ratios in which different ingredients are used, and the details of the specific steps in the brewing process will yield an incredibly wide range of possibilities. An overview of the brewing process for an imperial stout and a pilsner would be basically the same, but the results are wildly different. It's all about details. Additionally, it's important to understand that while most of our recognized beer styles are from Europe or North America, that's largely because the history of industrialized brewing has been dominated by folks of European descent. There's often been a lot of colonialism involved, and the histories of these beers have similarly been written by folks of European descent. That said, beer has been brewed on every settled continent of the globe, likely for thousands of years, and there are still traditional beer styles being brewed in South America, Africa, Asia, all over the globe. While most folks in North America won't have had the opportunity to taste most of these styles, they are just as worthy of our attention, and thankfully they are beginning to get some journalistic attention. These styles have fascinating histories and cultural traditions that are worth seeking out and learning about. Because beer is so complex, there are a lot of common beer myths that have become accepted by the broader culture. One I mentioned already, that lagers are all pale and bland and weak. Lagers can be as flavorful and as varied as ale styles, pale or dark, mild or bold, low or high in alcohol. Related, people have a lot of assumptions about dark beers, imagining they are all strong, heavy, or bitter. In reality, the color of a beer has nothing to do with those characteristics. There are pale beers that are strong and heavy, and dark beers that are low in alcohol and light-bodied. Classic Guinness is a great example. Low strength, light-bodied, and very easy drinking despite being dark as night. In beer classes, I get asked about whether cans or bottles are better, with much of the drinking public assuming bottles are the superior package. This is mostly due to the way beer has historically been marketed in the US, with cheaper beers being associated with cans. In reality, cans are really the better package, and they're really now the industry standard for craft beer. They block out UV light entirely, which can interact with certain hop compounds to create what we call skunkiness, an off flavor that really does smell like skunk spray. Bottles offer only limited protection in this regard. Also, a lot of people think cans will have a metallic taste that they impart to beer, but the inside of cans are coated with a polymer that prevents beer from ever coming in contact with the metal. Besides, your beer was brewed at every stage in metal, and kegs and draft faucets are metal too. Touching metal doesn't necessarily mean something will taste metallic. Beyond these reasons, cans are easier to stack and cheaper to store and transport, and they can be taken more places than bottles. I'll close by answering the two most common questions I've been asked while leading beer education classes for many years now. First, what's the difference between porter and stout? It's a great question, and actually a pretty tricky one to answer for a few different reasons. The first challenge with explaining the difference between porters and stouts is in establishing which type of porter and which type of stout we're talking about. There are several distinct porter styles and over a dozen stout styles, each with their own characteristics. When people have asked me this question at beer tastings over the years, they've usually been referring to American Porter and American Stout, two styles that were very prominent in the first few decades of American craft beer but have diminished in popularity in recent years. So let's look at American Porter and American Stout. Narrowing it down to these two styles should make answering this question easier, right? Well, kind of. The trouble here is that every brewer interprets these styles a little differently, and there are cases where one brewer's American Stout might be another brewer's American Porter and vice versa. That said, here are a couple distinctions that are often true. American Porter usually leans more toward chocolatey roast flavors, whereas American Stout usually leans toward more aggressive coffee-like roast. This is generally because of the use of roasted barley in stout in addition to the standard roasted malts used in American Porter. Both in character and intensity, stouts feature more aggressive roast. Also, American Stout usually has higher hop bitterness and hop flavor than American Porter as well. Those distinctions are true most of the time, but there are definitely exceptions. Interestingly, and unfortunately, both of these specific styles are losing popularity and are getting harder to find. Fortunately, there are many porter and stout styles out there, and they're all unique. Another question I've been asked a lot at beer events: why are there so many IPAs? IPA is the most popular family of beer styles within American craft beer, and the beers within this family exist largely to showcase the expressive character of hops. As we discussed earlier, hops can provide both bitterness and flavor and aroma to beer depending on how they're used during the brewing process, and different substyles of IPA will lean more in one direction or the other, while also varying in their malt and fermentation flavors, color, and mouthfeel characteristics. The most popular style of IPA in the US for most of the history of craft beer going back to the 80s has generally just been referred to as American IPA, and it has a good deal of hop bitterness with hop aromas and flavors most commonly of pine and citrus. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, bitterness became all the rage, with brewers in a marketing arms race to put out the most bitter IPA they possibly could. Bitterness can be delicious and satisfying when handled right, but thankfully this era of beer is in the past. IPA began a natural trend back toward more moderate levels of bitterness, while also showcasing hop aroma from exciting new hop varietals in the 2010s. And around 5 years ago, a new style of IPA took over as the most popular in the land. The New England or hazy IPA is all about hop aroma, often employing very little hop bitterness like the old IPAs. These hazy IPAs take advantage of the explosive tropical and citrus fruit aromas in newer hop varietals to make incredibly aromatic and flavorful beers. They were first popularized in New England, most notably Vermont, in the early 2000s, though a few beers in this mold popped up in the Pacific Northwest in the late 90s. The style stayed regional, though, until taking over tap lists across the country in the last 5 years. The beers we once called American IPAs are now often referred to as West Coast IPAs, a name that used to refer to a sub-style of that style. Yes, craft beer is confusing. I'm always here to help you if you have a question. Because IPAs were pretty bitter for so long and sometimes still are, it's common to hear from folks at tastings that they don't like IPAs or that they don't like hops because they associate both with aggressive bitterness. I always try to introduce these folks to hazy IPAs. They might still not like them, and that's fine, but there's a good chance what was actually putting them off was bitterness, and they'll enjoy the flavors of these juicier, fruitier, hazy IPAs. Hops are amazing, and IPAs exist to showcase hops, both because they can be really awesome and because of probably unknowable cultural currents. Hazy IPAs have become dominant in American craft beer. Walk into any beer bar, bottle shop, or brewery tap room, and there's a good chance you'll find more IPAs than anything else, though there are exceptions. I love good IPAs, and I'm happy they're readily available, but I do wish more people would try other styles and explore unfamiliar flavors, giving brewers the opportunity to bring fading historical styles and more esoteric brewing experiments to life. Good IPAs are stunning agricultural and brewing achievements, though, but there are other styles. There's a big, beautiful world of beer out there. If you have any questions about beer, Anything at all, even if you think it's silly or stupid or obvious, please don't be afraid to ask. I can just about guarantee I've been asked it before, and we're all at different places in our beer knowledge. On that note, don't forget to check out the Beer Scholar if you want to take your beer knowledge to the next level. I'll link to their site in the show notes. Thanks to everyone for listening to Bean to Barstool. Cheers.